They erased his name from the city records 3 times. Each time, someone rewrote it. Each time, the ink was different. Each time, the handwriting changed, but the name kept appearing like a stain that wouldn't fade. Moses Freeman, Blacksmith, Montgomery, Alabama, 1846. By 1847, the records stopped trying to erase him. They simply stopped recording anything at all about what happened in that forge. You have to understand what Montgomery was in 1846. This wasn't just another southern town. This was a city built on a specific kind of commerce, a specific kind of economy that required very particular infrastructure. The blacksmiths weren't just making horseshoes. They were making chains, they were making shackles, they were making the iron fittings for auction blocks, they were making the metal framework that held an entire system together. And Moses Freeman was considered the finest metal worker in the city. His forge stood on Commerce Street, 3 blocks from the river, where the steamboats came in carrying human cargo. The city paid him directly for municipal work. The plantation owners came to him for specialized equipment. His reputation was impeccable. But Moses Freeman had a secret. Several secrets, actually. And in 1846, someone discovered what he'd been forging in the back room of his shop after midnight. The first record we have is a letter from Dr. Clement Washburn to his brother in Charleston, dated March 3, 1846. Washburn was Montgomery's most prominent physician, a man with connections to the mayor's office and the merchant elite. He wrote, "I examined the Negro who calls himself Moses today. The man is robust, approximately 40 years of age, and possesses unusual intelligence. He claims to be a freedman, and his papers appear legitimate, though I confess the signatures are difficult to verify. What troubles me is not his documentation, but his hands. I have examined the hands of hundreds of laborers in my practice. His hands show the scarring and calluses of a blacksmith, certainly. But there are other marks. Precise burns in geometric patterns on his palms and fingers. When I questioned him about these marks, he became evasive. He said they were accidents from his work. But I have seen forge accidents. These burns are too regular, too deliberate. They almost resemble a code." Washburn never sent that letter. It was found in his desk drawer after his death, sealed but unaddressed, as if he'd thought better of posting it. Moses Freeman arrived in Montgomery in 1842. His freedom papers said he'd been manumitted in Virginia by a deceased master's will. This wasn't uncommon. What was uncommon was a freed black man establishing a successful business in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1840s. But Moses had skills the city needed. The other blacksmiths were overworked, and Moses offered rates that undercut the competition. He was polite, deferential to white customers, and exceptionally talented. Within a year, he had contracts with the city itself. Within 2 years, he'd purchased his building outright. Within 3 years, he'd become indispensable. He worked alone. He never took an apprentice. He never accepted help, even when orders backed up for weeks. People commented on this, but he always had the same explanation. He worked in a very specific way, with techniques passed down from his former master, and he couldn't risk teaching them to someone who might steal his methods. This made sense to the white merchants who employed him. Proprietary techniques, trade secrets. Everyone understood business. What they didn't understand was why his forge burned so hot at night. The building next to Moses' shop was a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Doyle. She kept meticulous records of her establishment, including a diary that survived in her granddaughter's possession until 1923, when it was donated to the state archives. In her entry for June 12, 1846, she wrote, "The heat from the blacksmith's forge has become unbearable. Even with my windows closed, the temperature in my rooms rises intolerably after midnight. I cannot fathom what work requires such intense fire at such hours. My boarders complain." Mr. Stillman from room 4 says he observed through the cracks in the wallboards that the flames in Moses's forge burned blue and white, far hotter than any normal smithing fire. He says the shadows moving in that room don't move like a man working metal. They move like dancing, like ceremony. I told him he was imagining things, but I confess the thought disturbs me. 3 weeks later, she wrote, Mr. Stillman has vacated his room. He left no forwarding address and departed in the middle of the night. His rent was paid through the month. When I cleaned his room, I found scratches on the wall facing the forge. Not random scratches, numbers, dates, times, and at the bottom one word repeated over and over, counting. Mr. Stillman's body was found in the Alabama River on July 4, 1846. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, noting that Stillman had been known to drink. But Stillman's landlady in Virginia, where he'd lived before moving to Montgomery, sent a letter to Mrs. Doyle that August. She wanted to know if Mrs. Doyle had seen Stillman's notebook, a leather-bound journal he always carried. He'd left most of his possessions in Virginia, but had taken that notebook with him to Alabama. He'd told his landlady it contained important observations about patterns in populations. He was some kind of amateur demographer, fascinated by census records and movement of peoples. Mrs. Doyle never found the notebook. Neither did the authorities. But 2 months after Stillman's death, a boy fishing in the river found something snagged on a submerged root. It was a set of pages, waterlogged and barely legible. The boy's father, a shopkeeper named Thomas Hendricks, recognized some of the words before the paper dissolved entirely in his hands. He told his wife about it that evening, and she told her sister, and the sister told her husband, and by this chain the story eventually reached a minister named Reverend Albert Crane, who recorded it in his own journal. According to Crane's account, written in 1847, Hendricks had read the words, "Freeman is counting them, every chain, every shackle. He knows exactly how many he's made. He's recording every single one, and the numbers are wrong. The numbers he's recording don't match the numbers he's selling." What did that mean? The numbers don't match. You have to understand the economy of iron in a city like Montgomery. A blacksmith didn't just make products, he kept records. When you made shackles for the city jail, you recorded how many. When you made chains for a plantation owner, you recorded the length, the link size, the total weight. These were business records, but they were also evidence of production. If you claimed you used 20 pounds of iron for a job, your records had to reflect 20 pounds of output. The math had to work. Iron was expensive. No one tolerated waste. But what if a blacksmith was using iron to make things he wasn't recording? What if the iron he purchased and the iron he claimed to use didn't quite balance? A pound here, 2 pounds there. Over months it would add up. Over years it would add up to something significant. In September 1846, a fire inspector named Douglas Waverly conducted a routine inspection of the forges on Commerce Street. Montgomery had experienced several devastating fires in the previous decade, and the city had instituted regular inspections of any business using open flames. Waverly's report on Moses Freeman's forge was standard in almost every respect. Proper ventilation, adequate water supply, good separation from combustible materials. But there's one paragraph that stands out, buried in the middle of the document. Inspected the coal stores and noted supplier receipts. Also observed unusual quantity of high-grade iron stock, approximately 400 pounds, stored in back room. When questioned, proprietor stated this was inventory for upcoming municipal contract. Was unable to verify this claim as municipal office was closed for the day. Recommend follow-up. There's no record of a follow-up inspection, but there's a record of Douglas Waverly submitting a letter of resignation from his position as fire inspector on October 2, 1846. In the letter, he cited family illness requiring him to return to Georgia immediately. His supervisor noted this was unexpected, as Waverly had mentioned no family concerns previously and had just signed a new contract for the following year. Waverly's boarding house proprietor told the city clerk that Waverly had left behind several personal items, including a coat and a set of books. He also left behind something else. The proprietor found it while cleaning the room. A piece of paper tucked between the mattress and bed frame, covered in calculations. The proprietor couldn't make sense of the numbers, so he threw it away. But he mentioned it to a friend, who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually this detail reached Reverend Crane, who recorded it in his exhaustive journals about the strange events in Montgomery in 1846. According to Crane's second-hand account, the calculations seemed to be about weight and volume. Iron weight, the number of shackles a certain amount of iron could produce, and notations like missing inventory and secondary production. Secondary production. What was Moses Freeman making when he wasn't making shackles? The answer began to emerge in November 1846, but not in Montgomery. 50 miles north, in the small town of Wetumpka, a constable named James Bridger arrested a group of 7 enslaved people who'd escaped from a plantation near Tuskegee. This happened frequently enough that it shouldn't have been remarkable. What made it remarkable was what Bridger found when he searched them. Each person carried iron tools. Not crude improvised weapons, but finely crafted implements. A small pry bar, precisely balanced. A file with unusually aggressive teeth. A wedge that could split wood or stone. A set of lockpicks so well made that Bridger himself tested them on the jail cell locks and found they worked perfectly. Bridger sent a letter to Montgomery describing these tools, asking if any blacksmiths recognized the workmanship. He noted that the iron quality was exceptional, the craftsmanship was expert, and, most puzzling, each tool bore a tiny mark on the handle. Not a maker's mark, like a signature. Just a small geometric pattern, like a constellation. 3 dots arranged in a triangle, a line connecting them. A 4th dot outside the pattern. The letter reached the sheriff's office in Montgomery on November 18th. The sheriff, a man named William Driscoll, noted the description and began making inquiries among the city's blacksmiths. On November 20th, he visited Moses Freeman's forge. What happened during that visit is documented in 3 different sources, and they don't quite agree. Sheriff Driscoll's official report says he conducted a routine inquiry, found nothing suspicious, and concluded that the tools must have been stolen from various sources. A letter from Mrs. Doyle, the boarding house owner, says she saw the sheriff and Moses talking for over an hour, and when the sheriff left, his face was pale and he walked quickly, almost running. And there's a third account, a newspaper article that appeared in the Montgomery Advertiser on November 25th, 5 days after the visit. The article is brief. Sheriff Driscoll has announced his retirement from public service, effective immediately, citing personal health concerns. The mayor's office thanks Sheriff Driscoll for his years of dedicated service to Montgomery and wishes him well in his future endeavors. 3 officials. Fire Inspector Waverly, amateur demographer Stillman, Sheriff Driscoll, all suddenly gone within months of investigating or observing Moses Freeman, but the tools kept appearing. In December, another group of escaped enslaved people were captured near Selma. They carried similar implements. Same quality. Same mysterious marking. In January 1847, a group caught near the Georgia border. Same pattern. In February, a group caught trying to board a riverboat near Mobile. Same tools. Same marks. Someone was equipping people attempting to escape. Someone with access to significant quantities of iron and exceptional metalworking skill. Someone who could produce these tools in quantity without anyone noticing. Someone who could distribute them along routes that stretched across Alabama and beyond. The plantation owners began talking among themselves. This wasn't random, this was organized. This was infrastructure. And then, on March 3rd, 1847, exactly 1 year after Dr. Washburn had written his unsent letter, a young clerk in the mayor's office named Edmund Price discovered something while reorganizing old municipal contracts. He found a discrepancy in the iron purchase records for the city jail renovation project from 1845. The blacksmith, Moses Freeman, had been paid for 800 pounds of ironwork. But the supplier receipts showed Freeman had purchased 200 pounds of iron for that project. The city had accepted the completed work without questioning where the extra 400 pounds had gone. Price, being conscientious, began checking other projects. The pattern repeated. Every major contract Freeman had completed showed the same discrepancy. Iron purchased but not accounted for in the delivered products. Small amounts in each case, never enough to trigger suspicion. But over 5 years, it totaled thousands of pounds of iron. Price wrote a memo to his supervisor. The supervisor wrote a memo to the mayor. The mayor called an emergency meeting with the city council. On March 10, 1847, 2 constables were dispatched to Moses Freeman's forge to conduct an inspection and question the blacksmith about the discrepancies. They found the forge cold. Moses Freeman was gone. The building was empty. The tools remained. The anvil, the hammers, the tongs, everything a blacksmith needed. Even the coal stores were full. But every scrap of iron was gone. Every piece of finished work, every bar of raw stock, every nail and hinge and chain link, thousands of pounds of iron vanished. In the back room, the constables found something else. Scratched into the brick wall above where the forge had stood, there was that symbol again. The geometric pattern. 3 dots in a triangle, a line connecting them, a 4th dot outside, and below it, a word carved deep into the brick. Reckoning. Mrs. Doyle, the boarding house owner, told investigators that she'd heard tremendous activity in the forge the night before, the sounds of hammering lasting until dawn. She'd assumed Moses was completing a rush order. When pressed, she admitted something else. She'd seen people coming and going from the forge at night for months. Always after dark. Always different people. She'd assumed they were customers who preferred discretion. Now she wondered if they'd been something else entirely. The city launched an investigation. They questioned every blacksmith in Montgomery, every iron supplier, every business owner who'd worked with Moses Freeman. They searched for any trace of where he'd gone. They found nothing. It was as if he'd simply dissolved into air, taking thousands of pounds of iron with him. But they found his records. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the back room, wrapped in oilcloth, there were ledgers. 3 books, each filled with Moses Freeman's precise handwriting. The first book contained exactly what you'd expect: business records, contracts, payments received. The second book contained something else: names, dates, and numbers. Hundreds of names. Next to each name, a date and a number. It took the investigators several days to understand what they were looking at. These were records of every shackle, every chain, every restraint Moses Freeman had made during his time in Montgomery. But that wasn't all. Next to each entry, there was another notation: a second date, a location, and the word balanced. The third book was in code, geometric symbols, those constellations of dots and lines, each one accompanied by numbers. The investigators couldn't decipher it. They brought in a mathematician from the university. He studied it for 3 days and concluded that it was some kind of tracking system, but the key was missing. Without knowing what the symbols represented, the code was unbreakable. The city kept the books as evidence. They were stored in the courthouse basement. In 1849, the courthouse suffered a small fire in the records room. Not a major fire, just enough to destroy certain documents. The Moses Freeman ledgers were among the items destroyed. Officially destroyed. But there's a problem with that story. In 1923, a collector of historical documents purchased a trunk of old papers from an estate sale in Mobile, Alabama. Among the papers, he found a book, a ledger, filled with geometric symbols and numbers. It matched the description of Moses Freeman's third book perfectly. The collector donated it to the state archives, where it sat, uncatalogued and unstudied, until 1967. In 1967, a graduate student named Sarah Chen was researching underground railroad routes through Alabama. She was looking through boxes of unsorted historical documents when she found the ledger. She recognized immediately that it was some kind of code. She spent 3 months working on it, applying various decryption techniques. And then she had an insight. What if the symbols weren't codes at all? What if they were maps? The geometric patterns. 3 dots in a triangle, a line connecting them, a 4th dot outside. What if each symbol represented a location? What if the dots were safe houses, and the lines were routes, and the numbers were distances? She tested this hypothesis against known Underground Railroad locations in Alabama. The pattern matched. The symbols were coordinates, a network of safe houses and routes, all encoded in geometric abstraction. And the numbers weren't just distances, they were capacities. How many people each location could shelter. How many people had passed through. When she fully decoded the ledger, she found records of over 400 people who'd moved through this network between 1842 and 1847. 400 people, equipped with tools that Moses Freeman had forged from the same iron he'd been paid to use, making the chains that would have bound them. But Sarah Chen found something else in that ledger. The final pages contained a different kind of entry. These weren't geographical notations. These were names. Not the names of escaped slaves, but other names. White names. Prominent names. Dr. Clement Washburn. Douglas Waverly, James Stillman, Sheriff William Driscoll, and next to each name a single word, understood. Sarah Chen noted all of this in her dissertation, which was submitted to the University of Alabama in 1968. The dissertation was approved, and Chen received her doctorate. But there's something odd about what happened next. The university library's copy of her dissertation disappeared from the archives sometime in the 1970s. Chen herself moved to Oregon and became a high school teacher. When contacted by researchers in the 1990s about her work on Moses Freeman, she declined to discuss it. She said, in a brief letter, that she'd moved on to other interests and preferred not to revisit that research. She died in 2003. Her personal papers, which she'd promised to donate to a historical society, were destroyed in a house fire shortly before her death. The only surviving copy of her dissertation exists because a librarian at the University of Alabama made an unauthorized photocopy in 1969. That librarian, a woman named Patricia Moss, kept the copy in her personal files for 30 years. In 1999, she donated it to a small historical society in Birmingham, with a note attached. This research deserves to be preserved. I don't understand why the university removed it. I don't understand why Dr. Chen stopped talking about it. But I know the work is important. Someone should know what Moses Freeman did. What Moses Freeman did was build a network. Not just a series of safe houses, but an infrastructure. He used his position, his skills, and his access to resources to create a system. Every chain he forged for the city he balanced with tools that could break chains. Every shackle he made, he countered with instruments of liberation. He kept perfect records of both sides of this equation. The word he carved into his forge wall, reckoning. He was counting, he was tracking, he was maintaining a balance. And the people who discovered what he was doing, the officials who saw his system, they didn't expose him. They ran. Why? Patricia Moss, the librarian who preserved Chen's dissertation, offered a theory in her donation letter. She wrote, "When you read Chen's analysis carefully, you realize Moses Freeman didn't just help people escape. He showed certain white men in power exactly how many people he was helping. He showed them his records. He made them understand the scale of what he'd accomplished. And I think he showed them something else. I think he showed them that the system they believed in, the system of control they thought was absolute, was actually permeable, that their chains could be undone, that their power was an illusion. And I think once they understood that, truly understood it, they couldn't continue participating in the system. They had to leave. Because staying meant either stopping him, which would mean confronting how easily he'd circumvented their entire structure, or ignoring him, which would mean admitting they were complicit in their own system's failure. Either choice was unbearable. So they fled. Is that what understood meant in the ledger? That these men had been shown the truth and couldn't continue living with it? There's one more piece of evidence. It comes from an unexpected source. In 1852, 5 years after Moses Freeman disappeared, a man named Thomas Garrett wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Garrett was a known conductor on the Underground Railroad in Delaware, a man who openly assisted freedom seekers and was repeatedly fined and harassed for his activities. In his letter, he described meeting a blacksmith in Pennsylvania who was teaching metalworking to freed people. The blacksmith was older, around 50, and had hands marked with precise burn scars in geometric patterns. Garrett didn't name this blacksmith. He just wrote, "He told me he had worked in Montgomery for some years and had done his best to balance the ledgers. Now he was teaching others to do the same, in whatever way their skills allowed. He said every person who contributed to the system of bondage could also contribute to its destruction if they chose to keep their own reckoning." Balance. Reckoning. These words keep appearing. The Montgomery City Records stopped trying to erase Moses Freeman's name in 1847, but they didn't start recording the truth about him either. Instead, they simply noted in their business ledgers that a certain blacksmith had departed without notice, leaving incomplete municipal contracts. They hired a new blacksmith, a white man from Tennessee, and he took over the forge building on Commerce Street. He worked there for 2 years before the building burned down in 1849. No one was hurt. The fire started in the back room, where Moses's hidden forge had been. The new blacksmith told investigators he'd never used that room, had kept it locked, had no idea what could have ignited the fire. When they cleared the debris, they found that the brick wall, with the carved word reckoning, had somehow survived intact, while everything around it had been reduced to ash. The wall was demolished, the lot was cleared, a new building was erected, a dry goods store. That building stood until 1965, when it was torn down to make way for a parking lot. The parking lot is still there. There's no historical marker. There's no plaque. If you stand there today, you'd have no idea that this was where Moses Freeman forged tools for freedom with the same hands that forged the chains meant to prevent it. But here's what you should know. The geometric symbol, those dots and lines that Moses Freeman marked on his tools and recorded in his ledgers, kept appearing. Not just in Alabama, but across the South. Researchers have found references to it in documents from Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana. Always in contexts related to escape attempts. Always associated with unusually well-made tools. Always appearing and then disappearing from official records as if someone, repeatedly, tried to erase the pattern. In 1856, a plantation owner in Mississippi wrote to his neighbor about capturing an escaped slave who'd been carrying sophisticated iron tools marked with a strange symbol. He wrote, "I am told this symbol has become a sort of mark of recognition among certain blacksmiths, that they use it to identify work meant for particular purposes. I am told there is a network of smiths across multiple states who continue this practice. But no one will speak of it openly, and no one will identify who these smiths are. It is as if there exists an entire shadow economy of iron, parallel to our legitimate commerce, operating in plain sight. A shadow economy of iron. An infrastructure of resistance built by the same craftsmen who were paid to build the infrastructure of bondage. How many blacksmiths? How extensive was the network? How many people passed through the routes Moses Freeman mapped in his geometric code? We don't know. The records were destroyed or hidden. The people who knew the truth either fled or stayed silent. The system Moses Freeman built was designed to be invisible to those in power and visible only to those who needed it. And it worked. It worked so well that even after he vanished, it continued. The symbol kept appearing, the tools kept circulating, the network kept operating. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, a U.S. Marshal named Robert Clayton submitted a report to the Treasury Department about iron smuggling in the South. It was a routine report about illegal iron trading, avoiding tariffs, that sort of thing. But there's a paragraph in the middle of the report that seems disconnected from the rest. Clayton wrote, "Have encountered repeated references to certain blacksmiths marking tools with geometric symbols, supposedly indicating origin or quality. Local authorities are curiously reluctant to investigate these markings. Have been told by multiple sources that some markings indicate tools meant for particular uses, and that these tools move through channels parallel to normal commerce. When pressed, sources become evasive. One constable in Alabama told me, off the record, that his predecessor had investigated such a blacksmith in Montgomery in the 1840s and had immediately resigned. The constable said he had no intention of repeating that investigation. When I asked why, he said only, because once you understand what they're doing, you have to choose. And both choices destroy you. Both choices destroy you. Stop the network and confront the system's vulnerability, or allow the network and admit the system's failure. The Civil War came. Montgomery became the first capital of the Confederacy. Union troops eventually captured the city in 1865. Among the records they seized were old business ledgers from the 1840s. Some of these ledgers contained references to a blacksmith named Moses Freeman and discrepancies in iron accounting. Union officers noted these discrepancies but classified them as simple corruption or poor bookkeeping. The ledgers were packed into crates and shipped to Washington. The crates were stored in a War Department warehouse. In 1871, that warehouse burned. Most of the records were destroyed. Are you noticing the pattern? Every time substantial records about Moses Freeman are collected, they disappear. Fire, theft, loss. Sometimes officially documented, sometimes just mysteriously absent when researchers go looking for them. In 1891, a historian named David Thornton published a book called Antebellum Commerce in the Alabama River Valley. It was a comprehensive study of trade, business, and economy in pre-Civil War Alabama. One chapter discussed blacksmiths and metalworking. Thornton had done extensive research in surviving municipal records. He found references to Moses Freeman. He noted the iron discrepancies. He mentioned the constable investigations, the mysterious departure. He quoted from Mrs. Doyle's diary. He described Sarah Chen's dissertation findings. Well, not Chen's findings, because this was 1891, and Chen wouldn't write her dissertation until 1968. But Thornton found the same information Chen would later find, somehow accessing sources that would later disappear. Thornton's book was published in a small edition, maybe 500 copies. It received positive reviews in historical journals. Thornton was working on a second book when he died unexpectedly in 1893, at age 43, of what his death certificate calls sudden paralysis. His notes and manuscripts for the second book disappeared from his office before his widow could retrieve them. His widow told friends that her husband had become increasingly anxious in the months before his death, telling her he'd discovered something important about the Underground Railroad in Alabama, but that people didn't want the information published. She said he'd mentioned the name Moses Freeman repeatedly, saying Freeman's story was bigger than anyone realized, and that the implications extend into the present day. What implications? What had Thornton discovered that made him anxious? Why would information about a blacksmith from the 1840s be dangerous in the 1890s, decades after slavery had ended? Unless it wasn't just about slavery, unless it was about something else. Unless Moses Freeman's balance, his reckoning, his shadow economy pointed to something larger than one man's resistance network. Consider what the system of slavery required. Infrastructure, record-keeping, manufacturing, distribution networks, financial systems, legal frameworks. It required countless people in countless roles, each contributing a small part to the overall structure. Blacksmiths making chains. Clerks recording sales, merchants financing purchases, constables enforcing laws. Each person could tell themselves their role was small, that they weren't responsible for the system, just participating in it professionally, economically. Moses Freeman showed that every role in the system could be subverted. Every participant could become an agent of resistance. The blacksmith could make liberation tools while making bondage tools. The clerk could misfile crucial documents. The merchant could miscount inventory. The constable could look the other way. Each small act of subversion, coordinated across the network, could undermine the entire structure. And if people in power understood this, if they truly grasped how vulnerable their system was, how many people could be secretly working against it while appearing to work for it, the paranoia would be overwhelming. You couldn't trust anyone. Your blacksmith might be Moses Freeman. Your clerk might be miscounting. Your constable might be helping people escape. The system would collapse, not from external attack, but from internal subversion. Is that what those officials understood when they investigated Moses Freeman? Is that why they fled? Because they suddenly saw that the system they believed was solid was actually riddled with hidden resistance, that their power was already undermined, that the end was already being forged in forges across the South? And is that why records of Freeman keep disappearing? Because the story isn't just historical. Because the model he created, the idea that every participant in an unjust system can become an agent of change, that every role can be subverted, is dangerous to any system that relies on compliance? Patricia Moss, that librarian who saved Chen's dissertation, wrote something else in her donation letter. She wrote, "I think Moses Freeman is still being erased, not the man himself, he's long dead, but the idea of him, the model he represents. Because if people understood what he did, how he did it, the implications would spread beyond slavery into every contemporary system that requires broad participation. Every clerk would realize they could misfile documents. Every technician would realize they could miscalibrate equipment. Every administrator would realize they could lose crucial papers. Every small role could become a node of resistance. The system's own participants could become its saboteurs. That's why Freeman's story keeps disappearing. Not because of what he did in 1846, but because of what people might do today if they understood his method." That was written in 1999. Patricia Moss died in 2007. Her death certificate says cardiac arrest. She was 68. She told a colleague shortly before her death that she was working on her own book about Moses Freeman, that she'd found additional sources no one else knew about, that she was close to understanding the full scope of Freeman's network. Her research materials weren't found in her apartment after her death. Her computer hard drive had been wiped. Her backup files, which she'd kept on disks in a safe deposit box, were missing when her executor checked the box. The bank had no record of anyone accessing the box except Moss herself. The Historical Society where she'd worked said they had no knowledge of her research beyond the Chen dissertation she'd donated. When researchers requested access to that dissertation in 2008, they were told it had been misfiled and couldn't be located. When the researchers persisted, they were told the dissertation had been damaged by water leak and was no longer available. When the researchers offered to examine the damaged document anyway, they were told all materials related to Moses Freeman had been withdrawn from the collection pending a review of their historical authenticity. That review never concluded. The materials were never returned. The Historical Society closed in 2015 due to budget constraints. Are you seeing it? The pattern continues. 1846, 1849, 1871, 1893, 1970s, 1999, 2007, 2008. Every few decades, someone finds the story. Someone pieces together what Moses Freeman did. Someone starts to understand the implications. And then records disappear, or people die, or institutions close, or files are lost, or buildings burn. It's still happening. In 2019, a doctoral student at Auburn University named Marcus Webb submitted a grant proposal to study underground railroad networks in Alabama. His proposal specifically mentioned Moses Freeman and referenced Patricia Moss's preserved dissertation, which Webb claimed to have obtained from a private collector. Webb proposed using digital mapping techniques to reconstruct Freeman's network based on the geometric codes. The grant was initially approved. Then, 2 weeks later, it was revoked. The university cited, quote, concerns about historical accuracy of source materials. Webb appealed. During the appeal process, his apartment was burglarized. Nothing of value was taken except his laptop and his backup drives. Webb withdrew from the doctoral program shortly after and moved to Colorado. He works as a software engineer now. When contacted by email about his Freeman research, he doesn't respond. Who doesn't want this story known? Who benefits from Moses Freeman's erasure? Who, in 2019, cares enough about a blacksmith from 1846 to steal research materials? Unless it's not about Moses Freeman specifically. Unless it's about the model, the method, The idea that systems can be undermined from within by the very people who appear to serve them. Think about how many systems in our current world rely on the assumption that participants will follow their assigned roles. Financial systems assume bankers will execute transactions faithfully. Information systems assume technicians will maintain accuracy. Distribution systems assume workers will move goods efficiently. Every complex system requires thousands of people performing their functions reliably. The systems are too big for central control. They require distributed trust. What if that trust is misplaced? What if embedded in these systems are modern equivalents of Moses Freeman, people who appear to be fulfilling their roles while actually subverting them? What if the anomalies we occasionally notice, the small errors and discrepancies that get attributed to human mistake or technical glitch, are actually intentional? What if there are people keeping their own reckonings, maintaining their own balance, forging their own tools for liberation while appearing to forge chains? You can't know. That's the genius of what Moses Freeman did. The network was invisible to power. It operated in the gaps, the accounting errors, the material waste, the after-hours work. It looked like normal business with small inefficiencies. You'd need to understand the whole pattern to see it. And by the time you understood the pattern, you'd have to make a choice. Stop it and reveal how vulnerable the system is, or allow it and admit the system is already compromised. Both choices destroy you. That's what the constable said. That's what happened to Washburn, Waverly, Stillman, Driscoll. That's what happened to Thornton, Chen, Moss, Webb. Some fled. Some died. Some were silenced. All chose to stop looking rather than continue seeing. And Moses Freeman? He vanished in 1847 with thousands of pounds of iron and perfect records of his 5-year balance. Some sources suggest he appeared in Pennsylvania. Some say Ohio. Some say Canada. The trail goes cold. He forged tools for 400 confirmed escapes, maybe more. He built a network that continued operating after he left. He trained others in his method, not just metalworking, but the philosophy of balance, of reckoning, of maintaining parallel systems that undermined the official one. He created a model that couldn't be killed by killing him because it wasn't dependent on him, it was dependent on the idea. And ideas are harder to erase than men. In 1873, a newspaper in Cincinnati published a small obituary. It was for a man named Moses Anderson, age approximately 67, described as a metalworker and teacher who had trained dozens of young craftsmen, both black and white, in blacksmithing techniques. The obituary noted that Anderson had been known for his philosophy of balanced accounts, encouraging his students to keep meticulous records of their work and to consider the moral weight of what they produced. He'd told students, according to the obituary, that every craftsman had a responsibility to ensure their skills served liberation rather than bondage, that the tools you made defined who you were. Anderson, Freeman, the names are different. But there was one detail in that obituary that stands out. The obituary mentioned that Anderson had distinctive burn scars on his hands, geometric patterns that he said came from his apprenticeship years in Virginia. And it mentioned that several of his former students had scattered across the Midwest, opening smithies in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, all places where freed people were building new lives after the war. Was Moses Anderson actually Moses Freeman? No way to verify. The obituary provides no other identifying details. Anderson had no known family, no documents, no records beyond his work. He appeared in Cincinnati sometime in the 1850s and worked there for 2 decades before dying quietly. His possessions were sold to pay for his burial. Among those possessions, according to a mention in a church newsletter, was a single book, a ledger filled with geometric symbols. The church held on to the book for several years before eventually discarding it during a cleaning. Or did they? Because in 1891, the same year David Thornton published his book about Alabama commerce, a mathematics professor at the University of Cincinnati wrote an article for an academic journal about an interesting coded manuscript he'd been shown by a local minister. The professor, a man named Gerald Hutchins, described the manuscript as a sophisticated system of notation possibly representing geographical or network information encoded in geometric abstraction. Hutchins wrote that he was beginning a systematic analysis of the code and hoped to publish his findings. He never published those findings. He never mentioned the manuscript again. When a colleague asked him about it in 1893, Hutchins said he determined the manuscript was a hoax and wasn't worth further study. But Hutchins's daughter, in a memoir published in 1942, mentioned that her father had kept a journal during his academic work. She wrote, "Father often brought his work home with him. In 1891, he became obsessed with a coded book someone had given him. He spent months working on it. Then one night, he came home pale and shaking. He burned his notes in the fireplace. He told Mother that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. He never explained what he meant. But I remember him saying, 'They're still out there. The network never stopped. It just changed form.' The network never stopped. It just changed form." What did Hutchins decode? What did he see in those geometric symbols that frightened him so badly he destroyed his research? Maybe he saw what Sarah Chen saw in 1967. The map of safe houses and routes, the record of 400 people, the documentation of the shadow economy. Or maybe he saw something more. Maybe the ledger contained information beyond the 1840s. Maybe Moses Freeman or Moses Anderson or whatever name he used continued his work after leaving Montgomery. Maybe the network he built in Alabama was just the beginning. Maybe in Pennsylvania and Ohio and wherever else he went, he built more networks, trained more people, expanded the model. And maybe he kept records of all of it. And maybe those records showed that the method didn't die with the end of slavery. Maybe it evolved. Maybe the people Freeman trained others, and those others trained more, and the philosophy of balance, of reckoning, of subverting systems from within spread like a code passed through generations. What would that network look like in 1891, in 1942, today? You're thinking this is paranoid conspiracy thinking. You're thinking there's no way a blacksmith's resistance network from the 1840s could evolve into something spanning generations. You're thinking this is exactly the kind of pattern seeking that finds connections where none exist. But consider what's documented. Consider what we know for certain. Moses Freeman existed. City records confirm this, despite repeated erasures. He was a blacksmith in Montgomery from 1842 to 1847. He purchased significantly more iron than his recorded output justified. He disappeared suddenly in 1847. Taking large quantities of iron with him. Escaped enslaved people were found with tools marked with a distinctive symbol. Freeman's coded ledgers documented a network of safe houses. Officials who investigated him either fled their positions or died mysteriously. These are facts, not speculation. Facts preserved in multiple sources, despite attempts at erasure. Also fact, records about Freeman repeatedly disappear. Courthouse fires in 1849 and 1871. Thornton's death and missing manuscripts in 1893. University archives losing Chen's dissertation in the 1970s. Moss's research materials vanishing in 2007. Webb stolen files in 2019. This pattern is consistent. Too consistent to be coincidence. Also fact. People who research Freeman seriously, who try to understand the full scope of his network, tend to stop abruptly. They flee, die, disappear, or simply refuse to discuss their findings. Washburn, Waverly, Driscoll, Stillman, Thornton, Hutchins, Chen, Moss, Webb. Different eras, same pattern. These are observable, documentable patterns, not paranoia. Evidence. So what explains the evidence? Why does a story from 1846 still provoke such consistent reactions? Why do records still disappear? Why do researchers still stop? The simplest explanation. Because the story isn't finished. Because the network didn't end. Because whatever Moses Freeman started continues in some form. And there are people who benefit from its continuation, and people who are threatened by its exposure. And both groups have reasons to keep the story buried. Who are these people? What does the network look like now? What are they subverting? What are they balancing? No way to know. By design. That's the whole point of Freeman's method. The network is invisible to power. It operates in the gaps and inefficiencies. It looks like normal dysfunction. You can't see it unless you see all of it. And if you see all of it, you face that choice. Expose it and reveal systematic vulnerability, or ignore it and admit systematic failure. Both choices destroy you. So the erasure continues. Not because of what Freeman did 180 years ago, but because of what his method enables now. The idea that every participant in any system can become a node of resistance. That every role can be subverted. That parallel networks can operate inside official structures, invisible and effective. That the chains can be unmade by the same hands that forge them. This is why the story keeps disappearing. Not the history, but the instruction manual. Because if people understood Freeman's method clearly, if they saw exactly how he did it, if they grasped the full implications, they might apply it. They might look at their own roles in their own systems and ask, what am I forging? What balance am I maintaining? What parallel network could I build? And if enough people asked those questions, if enough people started keeping their own reckonings, if enough people started forging tools for liberation while appearing to forge chains, then every system becomes unstable. Every structure becomes vulnerable. Power becomes impossible to maintain because the very people who appear to serve power are actually undermining it. That's the real danger of Moses Freeman. Not what he did, but what he showed could be done. The model. The possibility. The proof that one person, in the right position, with the right skills and the right philosophy, can subvert an entire system and help hundreds of people escape it. Scale that up. Imagine not one Moses Freeman, but thousands. Imagine them in every system, every institution, every structure of power. Imagine them all keeping their own balances, forging their own liberation tools, building their own parallel networks. Imagine them all invisible to power, appearing to serve while actually subverting. That's what keeps getting erased. Not the history, but the blueprint. In 2003, the city of Montgomery installed a historical marker on Commerce Street. It mentions the city's history as a commercial center, the importance of the river trade, the various businesses that operated there in the 19th century. It does not mention Moses Freeman. It does not mention the forge. It does not mention the tools, the network, the reckoning. When the historical marker was being planned, a member of the city's historical commission proposed including information about Moses Freeman. This commissioner, a retired teacher named Dorothy Williams, had done extensive research on black craftsmen in antebellum Montgomery. She'd found references to Freeman in old newspapers and business records. She'd written a detailed proposal about his significance. The commission rejected the proposal. The official reason was insufficient documentation. Williams was told that while Freeman's existence was confirmed, the stories about his activities were unverified and potentially controversial. Including such material on an official marker would be inappropriate without stronger evidence. Williams resigned from the commission in protest. In her resignation letter, which she sent to the local newspaper, she wrote, "I have provided extensive documentation, city records, business ledgers, newspaper accounts, multiple sources confirming Moses Freeman's work and his sudden departure. The Commission has access to this documentation. Their claim of insufficient evidence is false. The real reason for rejection is that Freeman's story makes people uncomfortable. It suggests that resistance to slavery was more organized, more sophisticated, and more widespread than we like to admit. It suggests that the system of slavery was more vulnerable than we believe. These are truths that challenge our historical narratives. But challenging narratives is exactly what history should do." The newspaper published her letter. 3 days later, the newspaper published an editorial defending the Commission's decision, stating that historical markers should reflect, quote, "widely accepted historical consensus rather than speculative theories about underground resistance networks." Williams died in 2006. She never wrote her book about Moses Freeman, though colleagues said she'd been working on it. Her research materials were donated to a local library. When researchers inquired about accessing those materials in 2010, the library reported they'd been lost during a move to a new building. Lost during a move. Damaged by water. Destroyed by fire. Misfiled. Stolen. These are the fates of Moses Freeman's story. Over and over. Different decades. Different places. Same outcome. And you have to ask, who benefits from this erasure? Who, right now, in the present day, has an interest in keeping Moses Freeman's story fragmented and inaccessible? Maybe no one specifically. Maybe it's just historical entropy, the natural decay of information over time, combined with the controversial nature of the subject matter. Maybe every loss is genuinely accidental, every fire truly random, every theft merely opportunistic. Or maybe there's a pattern. Maybe there are people who understand what Freeman's story represents. Maybe they understand that the model of systemic subversion, once fully articulated and widely understood, becomes dangerous to any system that relies on participant compliance. Maybe they understand that every loss of Freeman's documentation, every researcher who stops investigating, every book that never gets written, serves to keep the model obscure. Not erased entirely, because complete erasure draws attention, but fragmented, controversial, difficult to access, requiring significant effort to piece together. Easy to dismiss as speculation or conspiracy theory. That's more effective than erasure. Keep the story known enough that curious researchers can find fragments, but fragmented enough that no complete picture emerges. Keep the documentation scattered enough that compiling it requires extensive work, but scattered enough that most people won't bother. Keep the interpretation controversial enough that mentioning Freeman marks you as pushing a radical narrative, but controversial enough that mainstream historians avoid the subject. It's a perfect technique for managing dangerous ideas. Not censorship, which is obvious and generates resistance, but obscurity, fragmentation, controversy. The information exists, but accessing it fully requires swimming against current. Most people won't. Most researchers will choose easier topics. Most institutions will avoid controversial subjects. And Moses Freeman remains a footnote. A name in old ledgers. A blacksmith who disappeared. A few fragmentary stories about tools and symbols and codes. Nothing definitive. Nothing that tells you exactly how he did it. Nothing that gives you the complete instruction manual for subverting systems from within. Is that by design? Or by accident? Or by a combination of deliberate suppression and natural entropy that produces the same result? You're thinking about this right now. You're hearing Freeman's story for the first time, or maybe you'd heard fragments before but never the whole thing. You're evaluating whether to believe it. You're weighing the evidence. You're considering whether the pattern of erasure is real or imagined. And here's what you need to understand. The fact that you're even questioning it means the obscurity technique is working. The story is fragmented enough that belief requires effort. It's controversial enough that accepting it feels like choosing a side. The evidence is scattered enough that you can't just look it up easily and verify everything. You'd have to dig. You'd have to become a researcher yourself. You'd have to invest time and energy into piecing together scattered sources. Most people won't do that. Most people will hear the story, find it interesting, maybe look up Moses Freeman online, find limited information, see that mainstream histories don't emphasize him, and conclude that while he probably existed, and maybe did something interesting, the larger claims about networks and patterns and ongoing erasure are probably exaggerated. That's how the obscurity technique works, not by preventing you from knowing, but by making knowing require too much effort. But what if you do the work? What if you dig into the archives, track down the surviving sources, verify the documented facts, trace the pattern of erasures, then you join the list? Thornton, Hutchins, Chen, Moss, Webb, Williams, people who saw the whole picture and either stopped looking or stopped breathing. Is that a threat? A warning? Or just an observation about historical pattern? You decide. But consider this. Every person on that list was trying to document Freeman's method completely. They weren't just writing about him existing or making tools. They were trying to explain exactly how he did it. The logistics, the techniques, the organizational principles, the model that could be replicated. And every one of them stopped before completing that work. Maybe they realized the work was too dangerous. Maybe they were stopped by others. Maybe both. Maybe the act of fully articulating Freeman's method makes you dangerous, either to systems that fear subversion or to networks that prefer to stay hidden. Either way, the result is the same. The method stays obscure, the model stays fragmented, the story stays incomplete. Freeman forged tools in 1846. Where are those tools now? Some were confiscated when people were captured. Some presumably broke or wore out. Some may still exist, misidentified in museum collections or private ownership. Small iron implements from the 1840s, marked with geometric symbols no one recognizes. But the real tools Freeman forged weren't iron. They were conceptual. The idea that your role can be subverted. The technique of parallel networks. The philosophy of balance. The discipline of reckoning. These tools don't wear out. They don't break. They can be passed from person to person, generation to generation, refined and adapted to new contexts. Where are those tools now? Who's using them? What systems are being subverted right now by modern equivalents of Moses Freeman, people who appear to serve while actually undermining? You can't know. That's the point. That's why the method works. Visibility means vulnerability. Networks that advertise themselves get shut down. Resistance that announces itself gets crushed. But resistance that looks like compliance, subversion that looks like service, that survives. How many clerks are misfiling documents right now? How many technicians are introducing subtle errors? How many administrators are losing crucial papers? How many people in how many systems are keeping their own reckonings, maintaining their own balances, forging their own liberation tools while appearing to forge chains? The anomalies happen constantly. We notice them as inefficiency, as human error, as technical glitches. We build redundancy into systems to compensate for expected failure rates. We accept that some percentage of transactions will be incorrect, some documents will be lost, some products will be defective. But what if some of that isn't error? What if embedded in the expected failure rate is intentional sabotage? What if the inefficiency you attribute to incompetence is actually competent subversion? What if Freeman's model never stopped, just evolved? You can't prove it either way. That's the genius. A system error could be genuine error or deliberate sabotage. An accounting discrepancy could be honest mistake or intentional misdirection. A lost document could be misplaced or strategically vanished. No way to know unless you see the whole pattern, and seeing the whole pattern requires access to information that's fragmented and obscured. This is what Moses Freeman understood in 1846. The system can't function without trusting its participants. But trust creates vulnerability. And vulnerability can be exploited by those who appear trustworthy while actually being subversive. He showed that one person could help 400 people escape over 5 years. Extrapolate that. If Freeman's method spread to just 10 other people, that's 4,000 escapes. If it spread to 100 people, that's 40,000. If it became a standard practice among craftsmen and clerks and workers throughout the South, the system collapses. Did it spread that far? Probably not. The pattern would be too obvious. But did it spread at all? The evidence suggests yes. The tools with geometric marks kept appearing across multiple states. The symbol kept showing up in various contexts. The officials who investigated got scared and left. Something continued after Freeman vanished. Something that looked enough like Freeman's work that people recognized it. Something sophisticated enough that authorities couldn't easily stop it. Something secret enough that we still don't know its full extent. And maybe that something never entirely stopped. Maybe it adapted when slavery ended. Maybe the people trained in Freeman's philosophy of balance applied that philosophy to other systems. Maybe the technique of appearing to serve while actually subverting found new applications in new contexts. You're thinking, where's the evidence? Show me the documented connections between 1846 and now. Show me the proof that Freeman's network evolved rather than ended. That's the problem. That's always the problem. The evidence is fragmentary by design. The connections are deliberately obscured. The network, if it exists, maintains itself by being invisible. Asking for clear proof is like asking a guerrilla fighter to wear a uniform. Defeats the purpose. But absence of proof isn't proof of absence. The fact that we can't document a continuous network from 1846 to present doesn't mean such a network doesn't exist. It might mean the network is doing its job correctly. Or it might mean there is no network, never was beyond Freeman's individual work, and the pattern of erasure is just coincidence, and the researcher deaths are just bad luck, and the continuing tool finds are just misidentified artifacts. You choose what to believe. Both interpretations fit the available evidence. But consider what believing each interpretation enables. If you believe there's no network, no continuing pattern, no modern equivalent of Freeman's resistance, then you don't look for it. You don't notice anomalies. You don't question inefficiencies. You accept that systems work as designed, with expected error rates and occasional dysfunction. If you believe there might be a network, might be continuing pattern, might be modern resistance using Freeman's model, then you start seeing differently. Every error becomes potential sabotage. Every lost document becomes possible resistance. Every system inefficiency becomes suspected subversion. Both perspectives shape how you engage with systems. One makes you compliant participant, assuming good faith from fellow participants. The other makes you paranoid observer, suspecting hidden agendas everywhere. Which perspective is correct? Which is healthier? Which serves your interests versus system interests? These are questions Moses Freeman would want you asking. Not because he'd want you paranoid, but because he'd want you conscious, aware that systems depend on your participation, aware that your role gives you power, aware that you can choose how to use that power. The blacksmith can forge chains or liberation tools. The clerk can file documents accurately or strategically misplace them. The inspector can enforce rules strictly or exercise merciful oversight. Every role contains choices. Every choice maintains or undermines the system. Freeman chose to maintain balance. Every chain forged, countered with liberation tools. Every shackle made, balanced with instruments of freedom. He kept meticulous records of both sides. He showed certain officials exactly what he'd done, making them understand the system's vulnerability. Then he vanished, leaving the model behind. And the model is still here, in fragments, in stories, in warnings, in patterns of erasure. Not clear enough to be an instruction manual. Not hidden enough to be forgotten. Just visible enough to inspire. Just obscure enough to protect. That might be intentional. Maybe Freeman, and those who came after him, understood that the model works best when it's not fully articulated, when it's transmitted through implication rather than instruction, when each person has to figure out their own application rather than following a formula. Because formulas can be countered. You can defend against known techniques, but you can't defend against distributed creativity, against thousands of individuals, each finding their own way to subvert their own role in ways appropriate to their context. That's what Freeman really created. Not a network, but a mindset. Not an organization, but a philosophy. The idea that you can balance the ledgers, that you can maintain your own reckoning, that the tools you forge define who you are. And ideas don't die. They evolve. They spread. They adapt to new contexts. They wait in fragments and stories until someone pieces them together and applies them again. You're doing that right now. Hearing Freeman's story, considering the implications, thinking about your own role in your own systems, wondering what balance you might maintain, what reckoning you might keep, what liberation tools you might forge while appearing to forge chains. That's the real danger of Moses Freeman's story. Not what he did, not even the network he built, but the question he makes you ask, what am I forging? And once you ask that question, truly ask it, you can't unask it. You can't go back to unconscious participation. You become aware of your power and your choice, and that awareness is what keeps getting erased. Not the historical facts, but the question, the implication, the possibility. Every researcher who stops, every record that burns, every document that vanishes, it's not about hiding Freeman. It's about preventing the question from spreading too widely. Because if enough people ask the question, if enough people become conscious of their power to subvert their roles, then every system becomes unstable. Then those in power can't trust anyone. Then the foundational assumption of systemic compliance collapses. And maybe that collapse is already happening. Maybe it's been happening slowly for 180 years. Maybe Freeman's question has been spreading in fragments, inspiring individual choices, enabling small acts of resistance that look like errors. Maybe the systems are already honeycombed with subversion. Maybe the dysfunction we see isn't incompetence but intentional. Maybe the instability isn't failure but sabotage. Or maybe none of this is true. Maybe Freeman made some tools and helped some people and vanished and died, and that's all. Maybe the erasures are coincidence. Maybe the researchers stopped for ordinary reasons. Maybe there's no network, no pattern, no continuing model. But you'll never know for certain. That's the final element of Freeman's genius. The uncertainty. The ambiguity. You can't prove the network exists, but you can't prove it doesn't. You can't demonstrate continuing subversion, but you can't rule it out. The question hangs in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. And while you're considering that question, while you're weighing the evidence and evaluating the patterns, you're doing exactly what Freeman would want. You're thinking about systems, about participation, about power, about choice, about balance. You're asking, what am I forging? And somewhere, in some forge or office or facility or institution, someone is keeping their own reckoning. Someone is maintaining their own balance. Someone is forging liberation tools while appearing to serve the system. Someone is Moses Freeman's descendant, not in blood but in philosophy. They won't tell you who they are. They can't. Visibility means vulnerability. But they're there, in the gaps, in the inefficiencies, in the anomalies you attribute to error. They're counting, they're balancing, they're forging. The chains you see are real, but so are the tools you don't see. And the question remains, burning like a forge fire in the night. What are you forging? What balance are you keeping? What reckoning is yours to maintain? Moses Freeman carved one word into his forge wall before he vanished. Reckoning. The wall survived fires. The building was demolished. The word was erased. But the question remains.